Hello, and welcome to Spotlight On, the podcast that brings together business leaders, entrepreneurs, and experts covering a range of topics. I'm Nicholas Barton, founder and CEO of the Barton Partnership. We're an award-winning executive recruitment and consulting solutions firm providing permanent search and independent consulting services across strategy, sustainability and M&A, data and analytics, and transformation and change.
Welcome to the Spotlight on Sustainability podcast series. I'm Ashley Gordon, and I lead the ESG and sustainability search offering for the Barton Partnership across EMEA. And today I'm going to be joined by Simon Wong, former consultant, former banker, but also a thought leader on the topic of governance. He's currently the co-head tutor for sustainable finance on the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability and Leadership course, and I'm delighted to have him join us on today's podcast. Simon, thank you very much for joining me today and taking time out of your schedule. Obviously, great to talk all things sustainability, and particularly around the governance topic. I guess the best place to start, and something I like to do with people that join me on this podcast, is to start by sharing a little bit more around your background and career journey to date.
Thank you very much, Ashley, for having me on this podcast. It is something that I've looked forward to, so it's great that we're now having a chance to talk. In terms of my background, so I spent my early childhood in Southeast Asia, principally Hong Kong and Indonesia. But I grew up in the US, Hawaii in particular. But I've lived in Europe for the past 25 or so years and divided between UK and France. Professionally, I've worn different hats throughout my career. I've been an advisor, a policymaker, an institutional investor, and an academic stroke teacher. The common thread until my recent transition to sustainability and sustainable finance has been on governance and long-term value creation. In terms of specific roles, I started my career as a capital markets lawyer, working at Linklaters and Sherman & Sterling. I am a New York qualified lawyer, and I retained my qualification even though I've stopped practicing a while back. I then went to policymaking at the OECD in Paris, where I worked with different governments, particularly in emerging markets, on strengthening their corporate governance regimes. And after the OECD, I joined McKinsey and spent 4 years working with clients in different parts of the world on governance, regulation, organization, and strategy. Then I had a stint as an institutional investor, first as head of corporate governance at Barclays Global Investors, and then as a partner, activist investment firm Governance for Owners. These are very different roles, but quite interesting in both cases. BGI was often one of the largest investors in listed companies, so top 3, top 5. And as a result, I spent a lot of time engaging with board chairmen and other company leaders. Governance for Owner was a very small outfit, but it was backed by large pension funds. And so it was able to have influence in its sphere of investment. And following this, I returned to consulting, working on my own with boutique consulting firms, and I also reaffiliated with McKinsey as an external senior advisor. And at some point during this journey, I started becoming interested in teaching. So about 15 years ago, I started teaching at Northwestern University in Chicago, and then I was affiliated with the London School of Economics and contributed to some of its teaching and academic programs, and more recently at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And currently, beyond my academic and teaching activities, I'm an independent consultant working with organizations such as International Finance Corporation, Climate Bonds Initiatives, and the Board Directors Institute in Dubai. I think that's kind of an overview of my career trajectory and journey.
Great, thank you for that. Really good to get that overview. And obviously, you mentioned you're now working at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability and Leadership, where you're currently a tutor, and obviously you have your advisory board membership, as we can call it. But what led you to your shift in focus towards sustainability?
I've always been interested in sustainability. My family hails from Indonesia. I've done a lot of work in emerging markets. So that angle in terms of development, but sustainable development, has been a lifelong interest. But in terms of this particular role, it was very much serendipity. In the summer of 2020, CISL was launching a new 8-week course in sustainable finance, and they were looking for a few tutors for the inaugural session. Someone I worked with at ERM actually put forward my name, and then I spoke with them. Even though I wasn't focusing directly on sustainable finance, my background in terms of capital markets and institutional investing, and also working with boards and senior leadership, I think they found that helpful in terms of the background and expertise of the tutor team and facilitating the course discussions. And it's really been a wonderful 3 years in two ways. One is just the student, just a great diversity of background and experience and roles. They come from banks, investment institutions, professional services, rating agencies, government agencies, also international financial institutions. You have a number from industry, steel making, apparel, and you also have startups. So it's a nice blend of people. And as a tutor, you feel like you have like a front row seat to their organization's sustainability journey. So from that perspective, it's been just so enriching for me. And at a personal level, you get to know the students, you build personal relationships. And after the course, I keep in touch with some of them when they pass through London. It's been just such a fruitful and interesting experience for me.
Great, and thank you for that. The other thing I mentioned in the introduction is that you are a thought leader on this topic, and you recently produced an article on governance to keep net zero transition on track, which anyone listening to this, I'd recommend reading. It is a fantastic read and opened my eyes up to some of the challenges we're facing. But what are the key governance tools that can facilitate the transition to a net zero economy?
I mean, this article was something I greatly enjoyed writing. I saw it as an opportunity to combine my governance background with my more recent focus on sustainability and sustainable finance. And it originated last year from a discussion I had. I was asked for my views on governance arrangements that would demonstrate a company's commitment to and credibility on reaching net zero by 2050. And I thought about it, and then I shared my thoughts. And afterward, I said, oh, perhaps I can turn this into an article. So I started writing, which I'd not done for a while. So this was an enjoyable exercise. My goal with this article is to encourage debate and increase awareness on the broader set of tools to support net zero commitments, and also to prompt others to share their insights. So it's a start rather than the final word on this topic. I think that's important to acknowledge. The article looks at companies that have made a pledge to reach net zero by 2050. And as of today, according to Net Zero Tracker, this list comprises 941 of the world's 2,000 largest companies by revenue. So that's 47%, nearly half. So quite substantial. And of course, the impact is broader than this because there is a cascading effect. For example, Centrica, a UK energy supplier, now requires large contractors to also commit to net zero and develop carbon reduction plans. And what is quite unique and important about net zero transition is that it is extremely challenging and complex in different ways, one of which is you're making a multi-decade commitment, right? And that's pretty unprecedented, particularly for large companies. Their time horizons are much shorter normally. And second, this is a quite complex and potentially transformative effort for most companies in terms of impact on their strategy, their operating model, risk management, relations with stakeholders, culture, the skills that they need to develop within the organization. It is really significant if they mean what they say. And third is that it's filled with uncertainties and assumptions, net zero plans. If you read some of these transition plans, you'll see that it assumes that supportive government policies and investments are in place, for tax incentives, support for certain energy sources, green hydrogen, et cetera, public funding of R&D to accelerate development of technologies. There's also an assumption that enabling technologies will be commercially viable. And the third bit is that it also assumes that their customers and suppliers have the ability to transition. So for example, heat pumps. Can the average consumer afford them? And even if they can afford them in places like the UK where the housing stock is quite old, physically, can you fit a heat pump in the existing premises. And the remaining thing is that there is a question, and you like to think that people are more aware and committed to contributing to mitigating climate change. But there's always a question about whether management team over time will remain committed to net zero, because it's going to get harder, right? The difficult decisions, I believe, lie ahead, and we can discuss that a bit. And so in that sense, it's really important that we put in place rigorous governance to help companies stay the course on their net zero pledges.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned, obviously, will the management team commit to net zero? You've mentioned culture, and you've mentioned enhancing skill sets within an organization. And I think that relates to the board. So how do boards enhance their understanding of climate change issues and build the necessary knowledge to oversee net zero transition effectively?
I mean, I think the board has to play a central role because some of the impacts from net zero transitions are quite central to their own remit, right? So, for example, the impact on strategy, on risk management, on operating model, on leadership development. So it is really incumbent on them to take the time to become more knowledgeable and more competent. And you see different companies doing different things. I mean, the first thing is just to raise the issue, both informally and formally. So formally, what I mean by that is just put it on its agenda, and even in some ways, embed it formally within its mandate. So, for example, Unilever's, the board rules have a specific language in terms of the board's responsibility with respect to the climate transition action plan. Other organizations, they're not so specifically embedded in formal documents, but de facto, that is their role to approve the overall transition plan, interim targets, etc. So just making it clear that they have a role to play in that regard. But I think they can only be effective if they are sufficiently knowledgeable. And I think in that regard, spending the time through away days, for example, where you bring together external experts, internal personnel, to then just have an open discussion would be a start. In some organizations, you see that the board has made the decision that they need an expert, a sustainability expert. So they go out and hire someone with relevant background. And from my discussions with companies, in some cases, it's made a big difference. At one steelmaker, for example, the company secretary shared with me that it really has raised the level of discussion one level. And not only are they spending more time on it, but I think the questions and the debate are a bit more targeted and more precise and more granular. And this is a positive development within that organization. There's also a matter of looking at the structure, because overseeing net zero transition will be resource intensive for many boards. So thinking about what's the best way to staff this, whether you distribute responsibilities among existing board committees or you form a standalone, for example, a sustainability committee. Importantly, in terms of structure, making sure that you also have support at the management level through, for example, an executive committee. So those are some of the foundational elements. There's also an important aspect in terms of board function, in terms of their own mindset, because net zero transitions are quite still uncertain, meaning there's a lot of variables at play. Just getting comfortable making decisions with still a high level of ambiguity, that is something that both boards and management have to get used to. In this case, it's also important to have an open mind, be curious. And I think the last thing is to also have a sense of responsibility, in the sense that it's important that everybody play their part. And so that looking at it from that vantage point and thinking that, okay, what can I do to contribute, rather than always thinking, well, it's not possible. I think a foundational mindset of we want to contribute is actually critical in order to make progress. I would encourage board directors to go out and tour branches, visit factories, speak with suppliers, visit startups where enabling technologies are being developed, affected communities, and engage with activists. Seeing things and engaging with stakeholders firsthand can deepen directors' understanding of sustainability challenges and solutions, and strengthen their own confidence and conviction in steering the company towards achieving net zero objectives. When I was at BGI, a global miner organized a field visit for large investors to their South African operations. We visited a coal mine and a platinum mine. The coal mine was highly mechanized. So you basically drive a truck into the mountain and see how they extract the coal. Whereas the platinum mine was quite labor intensive. We actually, each of us visitors, donned mining gear, including a helmet with a flashlight. And then we descended into the mine on a conveyor belt and then crawled through dark, narrow crevices with water dripping down on you. And seeing these things firsthand really helped me understand the health and safety issues as well as environmental challenges much, much better. And as part of this field visit, we spoke with the staff of the coal and platinum subsidiaries. Again, that helped me become more aware of the cultural differences between different units. I recall the late Paul Miners, who chaired M&S's board, sharing with me at one point that he actually followed a crate of lettuce from a farm in the north of England to the shelves of an M&S store in order to help him better understand supply chain and sustainability issues.
And that broader contribution is obviously going to be essential for this, which means bringing the rest of the business into play here. So how can companies align their broader organization and internal decision-making with net zero objectives?
My article talks about alignment mechanisms. And I think, of course, board has a central oversight role to play. Companies also have the opportunity to then use these alignment mechanisms to ensure that management stays on course. And I talk about 3 tools. One is to embed net zero KPIs into executive remuneration. A second is to use material net zero KPIs in a new debt instrument called sustainability-linked bonds. And third, deploying an internal carbon price to help guide internal investment and capital allocation. With respect to executive remuneration, you're seeing more and more companies embedding sustainability metrics, including climate-related ones, into their compensation plans for top management. So in the US, a recent survey showed that nearly 70% of S&P 500 companies use at least one sustainability-related KPI in their executive pay plans. And these range from health and safety to diversity within management ranks to energy efficiency and GHG emission reduction. I feel that embedding net zero KPIs into executive incentives is helpful in the following way. One, it signals to the outside stakeholders that this is something that's quite significant and a priority for a company. Second, it also focuses attention of both management and board within an organization on this topic. And third, I think it provides a nice counterweight to the predominant focus on share price and to say, look, at this juncture, it is really important that we also pay adequate attention and in fact prioritize, climate change mitigation and other sustainability challenges. And it's a tool to not only reward management for doing well, but in some cases to punish them for falling short. For example, on net zero targets. What's interesting is then how would you structure them? And companies' practices vary. There are a few key elements. So one, in terms of form, do you embed it in short-term and or long-term incentives? Two, coverage, how broadly do you apply these incentives to the management team? Third, how can it shape ambition? And my view is that in terms of form, it's helpful to use KPIs in both short-term and long-term incentives. And in terms of the short-term incentives, to usually use it as a way to just ensure steady progress toward long-term goals. Second, my belief in terms of coverage is that it should apply broadly within the executive team. In some cases, you see it just being applied, these KPIs, to the CEO or the CFO. Expanding it beyond these two executives actually is really helpful in terms of reinforcing collective responsibility. For example, Aviva applies its climate KPI to its 12-member executive committee, including the chief people officer, the chief information officer, and the Chief Customer and Marketing Officer. The third is I also see companies using their executive pay to actually adjust their level of ambition. At one electricity company, for example, in recent years, they've been able to make faster progress in terms of decarbonization is set forth in the transition plan. And for them, they basically use the incentive schemes to actually encourage even faster progress on decarbonization. So in that sense, I feel executive remuneration can be a helpful tool. I'm mindful about time, so I will be a bit briefer in terms of SLB, sustainability-linked bonds, as well as internal carbon pricing. Sustainability-linked bonds, it's a recently popular instrument, and basically it's structured so that interest paid on a bond is dependent on the achievement of sustainability targets. Here, I feel like, again, if you use material net zero indicators as the underpin for the sustainability linked bonds, you can actually help companies stay the course on their net zero transition. And what's interesting about sustainability linked bonds is that they can complement nicely executive pay schemes, which usually have a 3 to 5 year time horizon. But SLBs can be issued for a longer term, up to 10 years. So it kind of bridges the gap between what's covered under an executive pay plan and then the medium-term horizon for a company. And then lastly, with internal carbon pricing, here it just helps companies follow through on their net zero commitment. So for example, Landsec, a British property developer, has stated that it introduced a carbon price a few years ago at £80 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent in order to reveal the carbon implications in our projects and operations and align our capital allocation strategies to our net zero carbon pledge. And basically, it's a way to management think about, okay, what are the carbon implications on a project basis? And in that sense, help, again, ensure that there is steady progress towards their net zero goal.
Great overview on that one. So thank you very much. And lots of detail as well. I think helps me understand a lot more around the governance piece as well, just with a few clear examples there. But how can transparent reporting and disclosure frameworks enhance accountability and ensure the credibility of net zero commitments?
Given the uncertainties of net zero transitions, I discussed in the article that companies on this path should subject their roadmaps, action plans, KPIs, targets, and other material information to scrutiny by external parties. And similarly, progress made over time should be independently collaborated. I feel that companies are on the journey, and as a result, ensuring that they are in constant communication with the external world. Validation by an independent and reputable external party, such as Science-Based Targets Initiative or SBTI, can reassure investors, customers, suppliers, and other relevant stakeholders, and may also mitigate the risk of litigation and accusation of greenwashing. You see different companies agreeing to do that with respect to different facets of their net zero plan. So, for example, fashion house Chanel, for their sustainability-linked bond, they said that they've committed to obtaining assurance, so verification of the 3 KPIs that underpin that debt instrument. Unilever similarly has pledged to obtain assurance annually on the net zero emissions data that it publishes publicly. It's also interesting. I mean, the Climate Bonds Initiative, they suggest that companies that have produced transition plans should subject certain aspects to regular validation. In particular, they talk about that it's important for them to have validated that the performance targets in the plan to date have been achieved and that future performance targets remain on track. And lastly, because transition plans will inevitably be adjusted over time, that any modifications to a transition plan will not hamper a company's ability to hit net zero by the targeted date, in most cases 2050.
Great. Thank you for that, Simon. And finally, do you feel optimistic that we'll achieve our goal of net zero by 2050?
It's a difficult question. And honestly, I think it's challenging. As I mentioned, for companies, there are many variables involved, government policies being in place, commercial viability of enabling technologies, whether customers have the ability to transition, and of course, also management and companies themselves, are they willing to change their business models to reduce stress on the planet? My sense, as I mentioned earlier in our discussion, that the most difficult choices still lie ahead. For example, with respect to business model changes, what I think is needed at many companies would be to make products more durable, lengthen product cycle, facilitate repairs rather than replacement of products. And these will likely hit the bottom line, at least in the short to medium term. And so we'll have to see how willing companies and their shareholders are to bearing these costs. And we might need governments to prod companies, for example, by taxing the use of virgin raw material so that sticking to the status quo becomes more costly for companies. There's also the issue of consumption, which is both an individual issue and a societal issue, because consumption is often a form of social signaling. Curbing excessive consumption and decoupling social status from consumption. And as a planet, there are other variables at play. You have the challenge in terms of different countries, governments still falling short in terms of their commitments. But second, you have the increasing frequency of extreme weather events. So what concerns me in particular at this moment is just raging wildfires in different parts of the world, because they're putting carbon dioxide back into atmosphere and depleting the carbon budget we have to keep global warming within 1.5 degrees centigrade. On the other hand, I'm optimistic in the sense that a lot more people are aware of the risk of global warming. And we also have a lot of smart people working on different aspects of these challenges, from technological solutions to trying to trigger social tipping points, basically to change norms. And we've seen incredible progress in certain areas, for example, solar and wind energy. So in that sense, there's reason to be optimistic. And also, to be honest, I think we have to be hopeful and we have to be optimistic, because that's what will get us out of bed and to take action. And there's no planet B.
So, Simon, I think that's a great place to finish. So I think the final thing for me to say is massive thank you for joining me. It's been highly educational for me to get to understand the governance piece a lot better. And I hope our listeners feel exactly the same once they've taken this on board. Wish you all the best in the future endeavours on the Cambridge course, and look forward to staying in touch and hopefully grabbing a coffee in the not too distant future as well.
Thank you very much for having me on this podcast. I really enjoyed the discussion and I look forward to staying in touch.